Morning, ladies and gentlemen. Those of you who were with us yesterday, welcome again. I hope that you slept well. Even if you didn't sleep well, it's still fine because you are here. That's all that matters. And those who have just joined us, thank you for coming. We really appreciate your presence. We are running a bit behind schedule, but then we'll try to make up for the time. The minister has to go somewhere, so then we'll try to move as quickly as possible. I received a request between yesterday and early this morning from people who wanted to see the Nxumalo family. They are here, they are just sorting out something. After the minister has spoken, I will then let you see them. But I think now something just came up as I was talking to Babum Ben, said that I think I must fundraise. You have to bribe me. So if each one of you can raise 5 rand, then I'll show the family to you. If you don't pay the money, then you don't see the family. Yeah, on a serious note, I intended to introduce the family before the minister started, but then unfortunately we can't wait because we're running behind schedule. So I will not waste any further time. We are honored to have the Minister of Higher Education in our midst, Honorable Nxumalo. He was with us yesterday, and he also woke up very early this morning to be with us today. So we appreciate the opportunity. I will then not waste time, because this is a very important inaugural colloquium of the Mzala Center, and the Minister then graciously agreed to come and officially open this particular event. Without further ado, then, thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Gomez, the CEO of the Mzala Center. John Pampalis, the chair of the board, and all the participants that are here. I myself actually feel very honored that you invited me to this important gathering, which is the second or the third colloquium? Second. Komalo seems to think I'm right, it's the third.
He might.
It was also second.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, it is. My speech tells me it is the second colloquium. If you recall, the first colloquium was held at UKZN in 2013. And from that engagement began a process that culminated in the establishment of the Mzala Center for the Study of South African Society, which we launched in December last year. Now, one of the key declarations from that colloquium was the need to establish unapologetically a progressive, left-leaning, if not Marxist, institution to do both research and analysis of South African and global conjuncture, as well as become a left-wing think tank in our society. I think that's important. We've got enough of right-wing think tanks in our country. There are too many. In fact, they are unhealthy for our democracy to have so many, and we are not having anything that is clearly left-wing and progressive in its orientation. I'm waiting for the day that the DA asks me, why did I fund the Mzala Center as the department? You know, I was saying to someone, I'm born here, by the way, in Maritzburg, in a place called Dambuza, which is not far from here. We used to come to this place to buy oranges. There used to be lots of orange trees here. The sort of what was small holdings. It was before it was so highly built, you know. I never thought that I would come here when I was a young man, addressing an august gathering and so on. But the point I want to make is that I was telling someone last week I was signing how much money for the universities. I was giving the universities how much? 32 billion. Yes, that I was signing, handing over the money to them. And that's what is called, I'd never, before I was a minister, I've never signed so much money. So I was signing 32 billion, which was the highest of that I have signed. And it's a block grant, which means they will do whatever they wish to do with it. Because it's only a very small component that is what we call earmarked grants. Like for instance, I'm taking out NSFAS because NSFAS has a specific function. But for instance, you would have an earmarked grant to improve learning and teaching, which means universities can't use that money for anything else other than that. We want to do the same, for instance, with the promotion of African languages in universities, to say, here are so many millions of rands, you can't use them for anything. Now, this block grant gets used freely, including the establishment sometimes, as I say, of very problematic institutions, but we are not saying. So, to be unapologetically progressive and left-wing is appropriate for something named after Mzala. This is why I'm really delighted. I was really delighted when the center was launched in December. I'm also very pleased that we are looking at South Africa 20 years or 22 years into our democracy. One of the statements from the first colloquium, which I want to reiterate today, is the importance of the Mzala Nxumalo Center in this current conjuncture of our democratic transition. I want to emphasize that my own expectations, now I don't want this to be misread. I wouldn't like the center to be an extension of government. I think we would be doing a huge injustice if we were to do that. The center must have its own autonomy and be able to do work that it sees fit, as long as it is within the broad legacy, tradition, spirit of Comrade Mzala's works. Now, but my own expectation is that the Mzala Nxumalo Center as an institution, its programs and engagements like this colloquium will seek to identify key issues that are facing us now going forward into the future. Institutions from the left, the few that I'm aware of, like the Mzala Center, the Chrisani Institute, the Joe Slovo Foundation, as well as the Harold Wolper Foundation, must become lucid voices of the left, producing rigorous research informed by robust analysis and public engagement. We are very pleased that the media seems to be having an interest, or at least sections of the media, in this center. Because also the center must not just be inward looking, it must also be outward looking and be seeking to engage in the public arena through the work that it could also be doing. And by the way, also we must not be satisfied about talking only to ourselves, but also we must talk and engage other perspectives, because that also further enriches the center. The center and this colloquium more specifically takes place in the aftermath of a very saddening yet necessary rupture and exposure of persisting vestiges of racism and prejudice in our society. Our view is that the Sparrow, Chris Hart, Guy Cliff, etc. debacle represent a window through which we see and understand white privilege, or the national question for that matter. Because that is a very important dimension of the national question, which was Mzala's preoccupation. At the heart of these racist claims is a class-based attempt to preserve either recreational spaces to the exclusive few or to preserve economic privilege and economic power. Again, an important issue, because Mzala's treatment of the national question was not in isolation. It was in relation to the class question at the time. And of course, our movement has evolved its ideas progressively to also now incorporate the gender question, that those three variables needs to be looked at together. I believe Comrade Mzala's national question will still hold relevance in interrogating conceptions of a nation and contradictions of nationality in post-apartheid South Africa. In fact, maybe this is one of the areas in which the center can undertake rigorous discussions and research. Certainly, we do need a proper conversation on the very fact that 20 years into our democracy, there are still large issues and realities regarding the national question. I wonder how Mzala would have responded to the idea of a rainbow nation. I guess I can take a guess that he would have been as skeptical about that concept as I am, because it served to mask some of the major challenges that we actually face. It was a nice, maybe as a cliche, but as a center, we need to interrogate that. There are new concepts, of course, now that also require interrogation. National unity, social cohesion, all those are some of the aspects that we will have to be investigating. The Nxumalo Center, maybe, that's a question. We will also have to deal with why are we still dealing with the national question rather than a national solution. Or will there ever be a national solution in any society? I don't know. But it's one issue that I'm just quite curious about. At the onset of the deliberations which culminated in the establishment of this center, one of the expectations at the first colloquium was that the Mzala Center and its activities should represent a center of excellence in research analysis and in providing left-wing scholarship and contribute to becoming part of a respectable left-wing think tank in South Africa. If there is one thing about Mzala, he was very rigorous, very thorough, and he was never satisfied about whatever he wrote. He would write it, publish it, but still feel that it's not really at the standard that he was expecting it to be. So then this center can't drop the ball when it comes to it. It will have to produce really high quality. But by that, I don't mean to intimidate our younger participants, the students. You are still free to make mistakes, because that's how you learn. You know, you move, you improve, because the center also has to be tolerant. By the way, the center needs to produce real analysis of South African society in line with the name of the center. Not those who wake up in the morning, read newspapers, then they go to the radio. and give an analysis on the basis of what they've read in the newspapers. We really need to produce analysts of high quality of our own. We can't do less using this name. We can't do less, Baba Sharaki. Now, it is my hope and my dream, and that of Mrs. Nxumalo, Usisumpone family, that the center carries excellence, as I say, in Mzala's name and legacy. I must say that, you know, the work that I gave you yesterday, I was just browsing through it. That's really high quality stuff that he was writing. I had forgotten about this piece that he had written about South African history, how South African history is being told, and doing a critique of that, and how South African history should be told. And it's still as relevant today as it was then when he actually wrote it. I also hope that you will provide alternatives to neoliberal, unapologetic conceptions and analysis of South African society. We need that. We don't have enough of it. Now, we must be able to produce even more compelling evidence and analysis to discount the claims of neoliberalism. It's very sad in a way, because neoliberalism is in a crisis at the moment. It's not just its economic model that is in a crisis, but ideologically also it's in a crisis. But there aren't enough counters to that at a time when in fact it's very weak. I think that is very important. Also, one thing that I would wish is that the center would also delve into is what in the African literature of the 70s, 80s is referred to as the post-colonial state, and the nature of the national question in the post-colonial state. What happens after independence to liberation movements, for instance? What happens to them? Some believe there is a script, or a narrative, or a path that is inevitable. Others are saying so now, that we are beginning to show signs of a liberation movement that has been in power for more than 20 years. Things begin to falter very seriously. Mzala would be writing frantically at the moment, reflecting on what is going on. We expect no less from those associated with the center. So the continent is very important also that we look at it. Not from a pessimistic, Afro-pessimistic angle, but the realities of what is going on. Interestingly, one of the key features of the current period, or the recent period, is that we are seeking to attain our objectives of making a better life for and with our people in a terrain of multi-party democracy. Not many of us, by the way, in the 80s had thought that we would be in this space of a multi-party democracy. With its positive side, but also with its hugely negative side. Because multi-party democracies, in the main, it depends on who has money. And also parties that are also sponsored by imperialism or by problematic groupings like the Guptas at the moment, trying to capture where we are actually going. Those are some of the problems with multi-party democracy in some instances. Now, I don't want the media then to say I was arguing for a one-party state. No. I am not. But at the same time, we can't be uncritical about some of the weaknesses of multi-party democracy. Also, during this phase in our country, we have political parties that we don't know who's funding them. We don't know who's funding our political parties. Well, for the Communist Party, it's a good thing that nobody knows who funds us, because once you expose that, we require it by law, we will lose quite a number of sponsors who otherwise would not like to be known that they are assisting the Communist Party. But generally, that's a challenge that we have. Now, Chair and CEO, we have to learn from others. Now, I have mentioned, of course, also on other different occasions about what I see as the potential value of the center. By so doing, as I've said, I'm not putting undue pressure on you. But one other thing I would really hope that the center will do is to bring together progressive intellectuals, both in academia but also outside of academia. Because, you know, something happened in 1994 that a lot of academics, especially black academics, that were at universities, were taken out. I'm one of those who were to go and be an honorable member of parliament. There are many of them. Others were drawn into the civil service. We must reach out to those as well, that they form part of the network of the center and not only just focus exclusively on those in academia. Those in academia are very important. Because also, by the way, the center does have to develop, as you are doing, an important interface so that the ideas of the center also find their way into our lecture rooms. They don't just remain outside the lecture rooms, because there is contestation in the lecture rooms as well. And by the way, also study the ANC and its allies critically, but engage with them, because some of the scholarship in our universities is just so dismissive about the alliance, you know. It's like it's not even worth mentioning it. I think we'll be doing a disservice, because the center can also act as a mirror through which the ruling party at the moment can look at itself. Not to tell us what we want to hear, but also tell us the truth as you see it. That was Mzala. Mzala loved the SACP and the ANC, but also where he needed to be critical, he was quite critical for purposes of correcting things. So in closing then, let me again congratulate the board and yourself, CEO, Dr. Mngomezulu, in successfully starting and driving this ship forward. I was glad to hear last night that we have started with your effort of fundraising, so that you do not just rely on government, on the government has given you a start. I wish government would continue funding you, but I can't speak for whoever may be a minister after myself. But we must make sure that whoever is a minister in future shouldn't matter much if we can be able to try and fundraise. I know fundraising is not an easy thing, but we will have to do that. I hope that a substantive publication will emerge out of this colloquium, so that we can distribute its results, and for the center to really begin to make its mark in South African society, just like Comrade Mzala made his mark. Thank you very much. So I've spoken for less than 30 minutes. I'm setting an example so that we can recoup the time that we've lost. By the way, when people see a minister coming late, they always assume this is the minister who is delayed. I've been here since 25 to 9, so it's not me. Don't blame me. It was just some other logistical problem, but it was not myself. I've been here very ready to be part of this. By the way, I must also apologize that by going away, it's not because I don't think that this is important. I really would have liked, but government offices operate on a particular logic, which sometimes is helpful. I won't look at who is responsible for this. Say, okay, we're going to Marisburg. What are the other outstanding things, by the way, you are supposed to do in KZN to try and fit them in? So we have a big function where we are placing 5,000 unemployed young people into learnerships and internships, both in government and in the private sector, as part of our effort to try and deal with unemployment with the Premier. So that's that. And then in the meantime, now I was told last night that the SRCs from the TVET colleges, at least those ones, I must meet with them. They haven't marched against me as such. I like the university ones, and this is off the record. It's off the record. So I must also meet with them. I may make a turn tomorrow morning, maybe for an hour or so during the first session, but also then I have to go back to Joburg. I'm not sharing my diary with you. It's just that I want to apologize. But I really wish you a successful colloquium. Thank you very much.
Let us give the minister another round of applause. Thank you very much, Mpepete. I think that when you leave the office, Derek told me that he's trying to Derek is the gentleman who's keeping you entertained, giving you some love letters. Derek told me that he's trying to get the cell number of the Guptas, not to ask for a position, but to stop them from giving out positions they also don't have. So hopefully we'll sort that one out. Okay, thank you very much, Honorable Minister. We really appreciate your input. And as I indicated, the Minister has honored us by availing himself. Yesterday we were with him. And for those of you who were not at the center, which is where we had the meeting yesterday, the Minister handed over the documents that were written by Mzala, after whom the center is named. And we shall be using those documents for research purposes, and we'll let you know in the future as to how exactly we are going to do that. But we do have the documents with us. Those were here yesterday, and they saw the documents. Thank you very much, Honorable Minister. Before we proceed with the speakers, I will keep my promise. Derek told me that my 5 rands are in his pockets. So if I don't get the money, I'll leave him to keep. We now have the Nxumalo family in our midst. I will request them to please stand up and face our dignified delegates. They would like to see you as a family. And thank you for having made it possible for us to have this event. Because without the Nxumalo family, we wouldn't be here. I, for one, I would be there in my rural village in Gwavo Manglusi Inko. But thanks to the Nxumalo family, we are all here. Could you please stand for the delegates to say? On my extreme left, Umama Nxumalo, Umama Umpo. And then the second one, Sis Balinde. And then this is Mzala Junior, Uzweite. This is the Nxumalo family. So these are the people we always touch base with because the center cannot operate without the blessing of the family. We really appreciate your presence, and we also appreciate the fact that whenever we extend an invitation, you never let us down. That is much appreciated. Thank you very much. Okay, can I then ask the three presenters to indicate if they are all here so that we can start? Professor Unterhalter? Okay, she's already here. And then Prof. Maloka? Prof. Maloka? Oh, Prof. Maloka is already there. I remember, I saw him there. Okay, Prof. Maloka is already here. And then Prof. Maraj is here. Yeah, so they are all here. Instead of coming to sit here at once, I will ask you to come one after the other. Okay, let's start off with Professor Unterhalter. And in the interest of time, I would appreciate it if all our presenters could take a cue from the minister and keep it short but still informative and entertaining. So that if we have some time afterwards, then we can expand on other points. So over to you, Prof. And Yabona Ngopere back. Thanks, over to you, Prof.
I'm sorry, I'm not Professor Elaine Unterhalter. Professor Elaine Unterhalter was invited to attend and she was unable to. She gives her apologies. Sorry, I'm going to sit down. And she's asked me to read what she's written for presentation at this conference. I was privileged to, when I was at the Education Policy Unit, to follow in the tradition that the Education Policy Units had of going to London and studying and being under her supervision for my PhD. And I've worked with her closely in subsequent years, and so she has asked me to read this. She starts. When Jenny Carlson mentioned to me that she was working with a team to establish a research centre named after Mzala, my memory snagged back nearly 30 years to some very engaged conversations with him that still resonate. This contribution today is about those memories. In the late 1980s, I was working in a small office in London for RISA, for Research on Africa in South Africa. A project led by Harold Walpe, linked with the University of Essex and loosely with the ANC. RISA conducted research on education in South Africa as it was, and as we might wish it to be. My memory was that Mzala was a research officer at RISA in the late 1980s. But in preparing for this colloquium today, I looked through some of the old RISA reports, and he's not listed in that role. He may have been registered for a PhD at Essex University, and in that capacity was attached to our RISA project. The fragility of the written record regarding his work seems to underline the importance of capturing the fleetingness of memories. The office we worked in was partitioned out of a larger suite, rented from the British Defence and Aid Fund for Southern Africa, later to become the Canon Collins Educational Trust. Mzala, Twazamile Buta, and I had 3 desks squeezed into a tiny corridor of an office, crammed with books, papers, and very early computers. It was quite hard to work, jammed together in a small space, and a lot of the time we talked. The fragments of what we talked about give some idea of the lived experience of exile, how different the experiences of fellow South Africans were across boundaries of race, class, and history. I think back to us all as positioned on different kinds of ledgers, with things swirling below us, to the side of us, trying to reach across and finding words created links. But much solidity needed to be built to hold them up, and we lacked time to do that. Our work was oriented to big horizons, and we tried to connect to make it more substantial, but the difficulties were large. Mzala did not tell me where he had been born, but I knew he knew Northern Natal, where I had worked at Charles Johnson Memorial Hospital in the early 1970s. I told him about the history of the Nxumalo area, which I had researched from old historical records for my PhD. He listened and clearly knew a great deal more than I did about the local politics of the area, alliance, and land disputes. I have paged through his 1988 book on Gatsha Buthelezi to see if an anecdote I told him about a meeting Buthelezi attended in July 1974 in Nxumalo is recorded. I remembered that Buthelezi shared the podium with a local official from the Bantu Affairs Department, and how incongruous that seemed given his persona in the press at the time as a spokesperson against apartheid. It seemed to me the attention of people at the meeting was fractured, not simply supportive or dismissive. This incident is not in the book, but many other facets of that complex story are. Looking at Mzala's book across the space of more than 30 years, its detail and richness of analysis is striking. In an age of sound bites and quick judgments, this extensive piece of analysis, closely argued with a wealth of detail, makes compelling reading. I remember some of Mzala's stories told with a light touch, although the events in themselves signaled moments that were anything but frivolous. I had a small car and was a nervous driver. We were on our way to a meeting at Harold Walpe's house, and the petrol gauge read empty. The choice was to go for petrol and be late for the meeting, or to try and get to the meeting but possibly run out of petrol. "Take the risk," he said. "Turn off the engine as you go down the hills." He had once been in a plane, he said, with other comrades that had to make a forced landing in Libya. They had to fasten their seatbelts and hope. It was okay, he said. They bumped, the plane juddered, but they landed. I felt reassured, and we got to the meeting. Maybe it was his tone. There was too much I did not ask. Why had they been forced to land in Libya? What had happened next? Why were we so distant with each other about big events, even though we spent days working together in that small office? A number of writers have tried to evoke through histories, memoirs, and imaginative works the atmosphere of the ANC community living in exile in different countries in Europe, Africa, and America. There was clearly a ferment of ideas, emotions, connections, friendships, but there were also the differences of where we had come from, where and how we were living in exile, and how we saw our futures. I think this feeling of being together and apart was part of the texture of conversations I remember with Mzala. We shared many interests, and yet it was hard to go below the surface. He must have been perplexed by how little I knew, and possibly hesitant about how to point it out. A long and distressing conversation we had over many hours one day was about HIV. He had published some articles in the African Communist questioning the origins of the virus. He raised many points about the colonial history of Africa, the ways in which controls over health were linked with controls over people, how Big Pharma was not simply benign. These were compelling arguments, and he had many facts, figures, and stories. I was shaken because I had only a simple way of thinking about illness and treatment and could not connect with the larger political economy background. That connection between the personal and the political was something Mzala seemed to live with, a particular kind of honesty about the complexities entailed. I remember some of his attention to the detail of events and histories as I listened today to speeches by political leaders in education in a number of African countries. I can catch myself asking the question, I wonder what Mzala would have asked. What are the agendas? Where have they come from? How can we evaluate this moment? What are the consequences of acting one way or another? I hope these fragments of memory evoke something of Mzala's quality for people who did not know him. I look forward to the scholarly work that will unearth many features of what he said in meetings, distill the key themes of his writing, and return the compliment to Mzala of the generous gift of detail, the humor and rigor of analysis that inflects his well-remembered voice.
Thank you very much, Jenny, for reading this paper from Professor Unterhata. And procedurally, this is how I suggest we do it. I have 3 speakers. I'll let them speak, and then after that, we'll have an engagement. So the amount of time we'll have for discussion will depend on how quick our presenters are. I think that the minister set the tone, and Jenny, in reading Professor Unterhata's paper, did exactly that, and I expect the same from Professor Maharaj. Professor Maharaj, it's Professor Maloka first. Professor Maloka, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, thank you very much, CEO. The Minister has also already recognized a number of dignitaries, and the family, of course, need to be acknowledged and recognized. When I was asked to speak on the issues that the issue that is bringing us today, and I thought to myself, what can I say today? Because I'm working out there on the African continent, and the topic seems to be asking us to talk about the South African experience. So I said to myself that perhaps I should ask myself what I should rather try to insert my understanding of the work that Mzala was doing and try to insert it into what is happening on the African continent, and try to say the issues that some of them were raised by the minister. If we are confronted by these kind of issues, how would you look at it? And I wanted to speak specifically about Agenda 2063, but I'm sure that a lot of you are familiar with it. But I thought that the focus, given the time constraints that the chairperson keeps on hammering us on, and of course he already has a monetary incentive to, that has been promised by, I think, by Comrade Derek. I thought I should rather talk about something more specific, about the tension between, historic and ideologically, the tension between Pan-Africanism and Marxism-Leninism. Because we were brought up in South Africa with Marxist-Leninists. When I was a young man and growing up, I could not relate to Pan-Africanism. In fact, I thought Pan-Africanism is a very reactionary ideology. But in my work now and practice, I deal on a daily basis with the Pan-African challenge. And now the question is, for me, which I've been trying to deal with, and try to understand and, the source of the tension between these two movements on our continent. And then the first issue is what I call I call historical incompatibility between the two, not because they're incompatible as a fact, but how they've evolved on the continent. You know that in the case of South Africa, the PAC, which became the premier or the prime champion for narrow Pan-Africanism in our country, broke away from the ANC when the ANC was embracing non-racialism and more radical and class-oriented thinking in the course of the 1940s, from the 1940s into the 1950s. And outside on the continent, you know that when the party went into exile, even though it was well received in parts of our region, Mozambique, etc., etc., but for the most part of the continent, our comrades there could not relate to the alliance between the ANC and the They associated it with race, but they also saw Marxism as a foreign ideology. They could not understand why will Marxism become so effective in South African politics and so on. And as a result, generally, Marxism on the continent is both ideologically and organizationally weak. You find Comrade Plato, I know as the party, have been trying to do some work in bringing together the left forces, trade union movements, and so on and so on. But outside South Africa, even in cases like Mozambique, Angola, and so on, it was liberation movements which converted themselves into Marxist political formations. But over years of civil war, some of them started opting for different approaches and so on. But beyond, it's a relatively weak movement compared to the general Pan-Africanist outlook that a lot of people talk about. I didn't define Pan-Africanism anyway because I still think there is a Pan-African movement, but we have never defined ourselves as a Pan-African movement in our sense, but the PAC does. So the first issue is really about the historical compatibility, how the two movements evolved on the continent. The second issue is how the two movements have dealt with race and class. That it's a topic that, of course, those who are all familiar with what Comrade Mzala was writing about, that it was one of the issues that really preoccupied his intellectual attention, how the South African Liberation Movement dealt with the two, and the debates within the party and the ANC, the broad liberation movement in general. But the Pan-African movement has never understood itself in class terms, nor has it attempted to bring class into its own analysis and understanding of the African question. The emphasis has been on race, but this race is understood in idealized form, in some sort of, with some sort of sense of racial causality, that because I have this skin color, then this leads to the following. That you know that some of you may be familiar with even early generation of Pan-Africanists on the continent, actually, in the form of negritude and so on, to say that if you are an African, you think in a particular way. And then also a strong sense of utopianism, to think that in pre-colonial Africa, there was not class divisions, it was harmony, everything was harmony. That the solution to the continent is to reinstall or reintroduce pre-colonial African political and socio-economic system. So it was understood that even though it changed, I think among the early Pan-Africanists, it was Nkrumah, towards and after the coup, who moved from narrow Pan-Africanism to a more left-wing oriented Pan-Africanism. And you know he wrote his book on imperialism in Africa. And of course, the Pan-African movement is always the defining feature of Pan-Africanism, of course, has been the common experience of slavery and colonialism. To say because of this common experience of slavery and colonialism imposes on us historically a particular historical destiny on us as a people, African people, and gives us a destiny without class differentiation. Yet, after independence, class differentiation becomes so evident and pronounced in how the post-colonial dispensation was constructed. And these are the issues that Comrade Plato was talking about. He spoke about the post-colonial state. Whereas the liberation movement, the Pan-African liberation movement, didn't think in class terms, yet after independence, class differentiation becomes so articulate, so pronounced, emergence of dictatorships, and quite a number of things, etc., etc. And of course, the struggle over the control of the resources, and this is the sum of things that we're experiencing here in the country. So really, the issues of race and class and how Marxism and Pan-Africanism have handled them, I think is a point that we can bear in mind. The third one is the socialist movement, or the communist movement, to be specific, envisages a future without class. A society without class, and where the resources and the wealth of the country is owned by me and you. By contrast, the long-term ultimate agenda of Pan-Africanism is the establishment of the United States of Africa. In South Africa, we've taken a view that it's an aspiration, it's a goal, but Gaddafi wanted it now. And some of the leaders. So this was a big debate, the union government debate, and so on and so on. But I thought it's very interesting if we could compare the two. Because the key driver in the socialist agenda is the class struggle that is driven by the masses, the poor, and so on. By contrast, the driving force for the Pan-African agenda as we are pursuing it now is regional integration, which is state-led and led by heads of state, largely the executive. And it's an intergovernmental exercise. We always say in the founding documents of the African Union, we talk of the union of the people, but in essence and in practice, the African Union is an intergovernmental body. And the people are there, we have pre-summits and so on. Outside the interstate exercise or the intergovernmental exercise, the Pan-African movement is pockets of think tanks, NGOs, and so on, and so it's not a coherent political force that on its own can establish a Pan-African or a United States of Africa. So the principal driving force for the Pan-African agenda on the continent is the intergovernmental process, which is state-led, of course, and also led by the executive. And what disappears, as you know, under communism is class. But in the case of Pan-Africanism, what disappears is supposed to be national borders and national sovereignty. So we're supposed to cede our sovereignty into a continental federal political entity. So so that's how the process of this United States of Africa is supposed. The borders are supposed to disappear, and so on and so on. And of course, you know that the end product of the socialist process, of course, is internationalism. But within our own frame as the Pan-Africanists, we don't think in internationalism. We see ourselves as a Pan-African community in face of the world. In the world, and now we're talking of a world that we must be integrated in, and so on. And there is being a debate here on the continent about rising Africa, whether there is Africa rising and so on, and to what extent, because you know we had the African Renaissance debate, blah, 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 and now recently with the economic growth rates, which were very fast on the parts of the African continent, we're resolving some of the conflicts and so on. So there was a mood that Africa is rising, Africa is rising. But people have been asking a question, is Africa really rising? Because in the discourse about Africa rising, we have not involved the issues of the ownership of wealth. In this Africa, this is rising. Who owns it? Does it entail the transfer of the wealth to the countries, even before you talk about the people? Because to a large, you could say that the resources of our continent are predominantly owned by external multinational companies and so on and so on. So in the whole sense of the rising Africa, this is a debate now that is beginning to emerge. To what extent is this rising Africa about the transfer of wealth to the continent and ultimately to the people? And this is, is the central theme in the socialist agenda, that the wealth must be transferred from the minority to the entire people. But where there is convergence, and a lot of convergence between Marxism and Pan-Africanism, is on our attitudes towards imperialism. But for Pan-Africanists, of course, our problem of imperialism is because of slavery, experience of slavery, colonialism, and of course of our experience of the anti-colonial struggle. But for Marxism, as you know, imperialism is viewed as a higher stage of the development of capitalism. So it's part and parcel of the struggle against capitalism, etc. And then on the national question, I thought that I could not make this comparison without talking a little bit about the national question and how it articulates itself in the Pan-African outlook vis-a-vis socialist thinking and so on. For Pan-Africanists, the solution to the national question was quite easy after independence, but it became very difficult when it was implemented in practice. The solution was that
in order to create the nation state, which did not exist, which was imposed on us by the colonial experience, we have one to recognize colonial borders. Because if you don't, then somebody, the neighbors are going to fight. So there was an important decision in Cairo, I think it was the summit of the OAU in Cairo, which said we must recognize the colonial borders. But within states, then the leaders said, we are not going to allow multi-party system, because the political multi-party system will create an environment where ethnic groups or nationalities compete for power through the political, using the multi-party. Then there was a one-party state. And we know what was the result of that. The one-party state generated into dictatorship. And the problem of the respecting the colonial borders, it led to a situation where today sovereignty is worshipped and is accepted as a fact. And then the Pan-African agenda of building or creating or establishing United States of Africa, if there's one stumbling block that it has to deal with, is sovereignty. And you see it in the intergovernmental exercise that the time when the leaders said we recognize the colonial, but at the same time they want to do away with national sovereignty, we put ourselves in a situation that is quite difficult. And of course the national question debate, you know, in South Africa, I think it's important the way Comrade Blade framed it. I also don't. I find the concept of the rainbow nation quite difficult to relate to. It's not good that there is being a resurgence of racism, but the resurgence of incidents of racism indicate that we're probably living in some sort of a honeymoon period and thinking that there was this nation, because you cannot hope to build a nation purely based on common ideas without a significant transfer of wealth and democratization of the ownership of the country and so on. So where to, in conclusion? I think the weakness of the left on the continent, and I'm using the left broadly, is reflected in the absence of class analysis in the continental and the Pan-African agenda. So when we're dealing with the issues on the continent, we don't think in terms of class differentiation within society. We treat ourselves as one whole classless against the world or against something else. Yet in practice, within the nation state, the class differentiation is a big challenge. And for some of us who are practicing diplomats, it's very difficult to raise class differentiation because I'll be fired from my job. President will say, you must, that South African must go. So it's important that the left project on the continent is given serious attention, and it has to happen outside the intergovernmental exercise, because within intergovernmental structures it's going to be very difficult to deal with. And then I think central to it is to try to insert class in how we view and look at the challenges and trying to find solutions to the continent. And secondly, the ANC, we've been talking about building a progressive movement. During the centenary conference, centenary of the ANC hosted an international solidarity conference as part of our effort to try to build a progressive movement. Initially, we thought we'll do it globally, but we felt the priority now is to start it on the African continent. Now we're talking about starting it with the liberation movement. But the progressive movement, I don't know if somebody has defined it completely. Maybe you have. It's probably one of the things that I would want to propose or suggest or put on the table of my brother, the CEO and the chairperson here. We have to deal with the issues of what constitute, maybe you can say both the left and the progressive movement, because the left will be part of the progressive, but the progressive movement is much broader. But what constitutes this progressive movement on the continent? And what should be its agenda, what should be strategies, and what should be the minimum package? Because we have to build alliances. Even in the communist movement, you know that you have to build alliances. The party has built an alliance with the ANC. But what if you build this alliance? Because the progressive movement, by definition, is an alliance of forces, both class and broadly, and specifically class forces. But what should be the minimum package around which you can build this class alliance of forces? And what should this? And then the third thing is I didn't talk about the Agenda 2063. The third thing is, in Agenda 2063, which is a long-term 50-year vision of the African continent, to say in the year 2063, we want to be here. We want to have eradicated, we don't want wars on our continent, we want to build infrastructure, we want a united continent, etc., in the next 50 years or so. But we see there, which is something quite unique with Agenda 2063, we put a lot of emphasis on the need on the continent to have what we call a transformative leadership. But it's not defined what that transformative leadership is. Transformation comes from South Africa, and I'm sure our chairperson, Comrade Nxumalo, it must have been ANC people who inserted transformation in there. But we talked there about transform. So we don't just want a leadership that is there, good intention, but that leadership must have an agenda to transform and so on. But what are the elements of this transformative leadership? For me, I think I'm currently working at the African Peer Review Mechanism, and this is one of the issues that I think we'll be looking at, to say, what are the elements of this transformation? Unfortunately, the African Peer Review Mechanism, we deal with indicators, we review countries, we measure performance, and so because that's our mandate. But perhaps it's also a useful way of looking. If we say this is transformative leadership, is it just good speeches and radical rhetoric, or there's something more? And I think these are the issues that a think tank like this could help us with. Finally, and then Comrade Blade took words out of my mouth. When I was going through the work of the center, I said, but why must we not talk about Africa in our work? Yet every embassy which is accredited to South Africa, including UN agencies, you know, when they are accredited to other countries, they just deal with bilateral issues. But almost every embassy here in which is accredited to South Africa, they have a dual mandate. They look at South Africa bilaterally, but they also look at South Africa as a regional player. So I fail to understand. I think South African institutions, especially left-wing institutions, have to also take that posture. Look at South Africa domestically, but also look at our role and contribution on the African continent. And quite a number of them are doing so, ISS and so on, but they are looking at peace and security, blah, blah, blah. But it will be very interesting to see how an institute like this can link up. I don't know how many left-leaning institutions we have on the continent. We do have many NGOs, by the way, but I'm not sure how many of them ideologically will be closer to what the Mzala said. But it will not harm for Mzala Center to be active on the continent. Not only ideologically, but in terms of creating linkages. There is, in some of the universities, you still have left-wing, remnants of left-wing thinking there. In Makerere, University of Dar es Salaam, Walter Rodney used to teach at University of Walter, and so on. You do have some people in Sheikh Anta Diop in Senegal, and so on. So it can play a role in linking up with left-wing, either individuals or institutions on the continent, trying to develop some common program. So these are some of the suggestions I wanted to throw into the thing, and to close by recognizing our minister here, Comrade Blade, not because he has paid me, like Derek has been doing in the course of this morning, trying to compromise some comrades with 50 cents. Because since you became the Secretary General of the party, we have this center, and I know how passionate you have been over the years about the contribution of himself. And when you spoke about this center, I thought you were transformative leadership in your ways. But to see the center in existence, I think for me, I think we have to recognize it. And thank you for, and also for finding a mechanism, an instrument within the state structure to support this institution. And I think we need to be recognized. And we must also be recognized that it was with your contribution that we also have the Christiani Institute. And I don't want to talk about the foundations because the foundations are different. But I'm talking about these two key institutions that I think we should support, the Mzala Center, and then also the Christian Institute, which is housed at Costa House. And I'm happy that one of your colleagues will soon be assuming a big responsibility at the Christian Institute. We will be working, and we'll try our best to support, to work with the comrades here at the center, and to try to see how we can work together in trying to support them in what I think will be their effort, an effort on their part to extend their work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Maloka. For those who don't know his new position, he's the CEO of the Africa Peer Review Mechanism. You can tell from his tone that he knows his story. It is not a hearsay, it's first-hand experience. Thank you very much, Professor Maloka. I was impressed when he talked about USA. We usually talk about USA when we talk about the United States of America, which is a very funny country, the way it was formed. And then somebody told me that it's a secular state because everyone seems to have come from Europe. The indigenous people were wiped out. If you read Gilles Castas, it says the devastation of the West Indies, looking at how people in the Americas, not America, in the Americas were wiped out, the indigenous people, and then the settlers took over, and then America came into being. But the United States of Africa, there are two things that I'm particularly interested in. There was a gentleman called Idi Amin Dada. Some of you might know that guy. He was a leader in one of the states in Africa, Uganda. At one point, he quarreled with his Minister of Finance, who came to tell him that, Honorable President, we have a problem here. We have no money. And then he asked him, can you remind me what's your position again? I'm the Minister of Finance. Who appointed you? You, Honorable President. Okay, I appointed you to be the Minister of Finance. And then you come and tell me there is no money. Just go and print more money. Because Idi Amin had no clue about this inflation. Like today we say the rand is going up, it's going down. If it goes down, then put it up. Don't come to me. Then when it came to the issue of the United States of Africa, he said, you know, I am the only African leader who is bold enough to challenge the West and tell them what is not right. So I think as Africans, we have to form the United States of Africa. But I should be the first president because I'm the one who understands the issues. Then he didn't get it his way. There comes the Kenyan, the late Muammar Gaddafi. Muammar Gaddafi, as Prof. Maloka was saying, Muammar Gaddafi was another visionary. But the only problem, he calculated his years and said, no man, if we delay this thing, I might not be around when the United States of Africa is established. Then he said, okay guys, let's move it now, let's bring it closer. And I'll be the first president of Africa. Then others can take over after me. So that's the problem we have. So, but these are our leaders. Okay, thank you very much, Professor Maloka. We're doing okay, And I think we'll still be able to meet the time indicated in our program. I'll now hand over to Professor Maharaj, who will be our last presenter for this session, after which we will then have an engagement. So if you have questions or comments, please jot them down, because when that time comes, there will be ground rules for that slot. Thank you very much, Professor Maharaj.
Thank you very much. And so, thank you very much. I must say that I haven't been in the province as much as I would like to be, at least since 1994. But to see the center being set up is a huge inspiration. It may actually help with attracting more of us re-engaging this one. So this is really positive. The presentation I'm going to make covers quite a lot of substantive matters, and I've arranged it in the following format. I'm going to encourage you, I'm not going to be reading the slides out, but there's a lot of information that's going to be contained within them. And this will eventually come through in the paper itself. And there's some very pointed remarks I'd like to be raising in a very critical fashion. And I must acknowledge that the reason I think I have the capacity, capability, and competency to raise it in this form is largely because of this person. You know, and I'm really happy in terms of last night's event and today, having a sense of reconnecting with something that was quite intrinsic to, I would suggest, a large majority of people that are my age in South Africa. You know, we often hear about generations and detachments, but they precede us. And the 1980s was a particular time, and this province was a particular place. And I really hope most of us that are involved in developmental activities actually carry with us, because this is strongly inside of us. And maybe I get the chance, I can chat with the families to even share with you how strongly this is. But this is an acknowledgement, and it's because of this that I'm going to be raising some issues provocatively with the object of making some critical points. Please recognize, I'm not a diplomat. I'm not a politician. I work in a public university. And there's a very particular reason that most of what I come to in terms of solutions are going to be about that institutional form as well. So maybe it's a little better that the minister is not sat next to me while I raise these, but I'm sure the message will be carried through. So, some of what I'm going to talk about in these three categories is really presenting you with some data. It's out of this data, the empiricism, that I want to reach maybe some analysis. But I think it's quite important, especially as we engage, that we do the rigorous work that allows us to generate data about what's taking place. And to that extent, I'm sorry, but there aren't many protocols. But rigorous and engaged scholarship is something I would really encourage that the center pay attention to. So, our world has been transformed, but it's been in transformation over a long period of time. Ourselves, all of us sat in this room today, have a long evolutionary history tied to this continent, but it gives us a place on the planet which is at least 13 to 7 million years. So you can imagine, when we just start with that statement, the ideas about being discovered by others is not an issue I'm going to be pursuing. But our responses to others encroaching upon the rest of the world is something that's generated for us significant consequences. We've seen the population increase, but it's quite important. Look at, not so sure you see the timing. All of these graphs start in 1750. There's a very important reason for that. 1771, we see the advent of industrial capitalism. And we see its effect population-wise in terms of what we manage to produce, the flows of investment, rates of urbanization, and how much of energy we consume. Not only do we consume energy, but we also try to energize the ground that generates our food. And this is a significant issue because in many of the discourses that we engage with, the question of rural and agricultural society is often excluded in discussions about industrialism and development. That fertilizer consumption, which is at that level, is seriously degrading the soil. And its consequences then are extremely dire for all of us. Another set of data following the same lines, and this increasingly are the reasons why our population is increasing at such a large scale. Now, out of these trends, we are also then impacting on the only planet that we are aware of that sustains us. We don't have another planet that we can leave to. And in this context, the mode of production that holds us hostage is not capable of advancing ourselves as a species. We're recently involved in some of the discussions in preparation for the next BRICS. And as I traveled in Delhi, there's a huge campaign, and you can see the populism that's pursued. It's on bus stations, you find it in posters throughout, and it's huge signs which say, "Save the planet." So, in an introductory remark that I made, I encouraged the colleagues. I'm not convinced that we need to save the planet. The planet may be here after we are. It's already been here 4.5 billion years. Remember, our history, 13 to 7 million years. We're only a small fraction of the planet's history. And we may not be here beyond our current life cycle because of the pressures we've generated. And these are some of them. The amount of carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, methanes that we are putting into the atmosphere is seriously damaging this shell of life, this nurturing environment. It is what we are doing that's generating it. It is not coming from somewhere else. And that's the second set of slides about these issues. We are depleting the biodiversity that surrounds us. In a representative sample of 10,000 other species on the planet, it's estimated, and this is within, I think, everyone's lifetime here, between the early 70s and last year, of that 10,000 representative sample, 54% no longer are with us. 54% of the biodiversity around us has been destroyed. This is what I mean by us being imperiled by the system that's holding us hostage. And this system then generates a whole range of features and characteristics. My worry is about focusing exclusively on one area and not recognizing other aspects. A kind of autism that locks us out of actually generating solutions that can help move us forward. This is just to show you that even though our production of goods has been increasing, note the amount which falls under finances and services. It's very difficult to talk about contemporary capitalism without recognizing the huge impact of financialization. I'm not going to do the detail, it's not a lecture in that form. But it's important that we recognize this because it comes very close to the issues that maybe the minister referred to as those newspaper readers giving analyses today. They are not keeping the larger picture in mind and then locating ourselves within that context. So one way of looking at this long history is in terms of the things that we have established, and these have been created and deployed effectively through capitalism itself. This is the creative destructive cycle of capitalism, at least since the 1700s. And in each successive era, what we've seen is us exhausting the possibilities and then transcending. When this graphic was done by a colleague, Carlota Perez from Venezuela, her suggestion was that we will turn around into a new age around the financial crisis in 2007-8. This is not what we've experienced. We are not making that transition. And there's a very specific reason for it, and it boils down to financialization. Financialization and the inequality being bred by that financialization precludes investments in a more sustainable knowledge base or knowledge-intensive society. Money is making money. And I'm sure all of us are feeling the perverse effects of that on the types of societies we thought we were party to. Yeah. So, after 4.55 billion years, we've now reached a place in our history where we are claiming to ourselves a geological age. Up to now, we've understood ourselves to be in the Holocene, the geophysical aging of the planet. Since the last ice age, we have been in the Holocene. We are now truncating that Holocene to give it a more appropriate title that includes us in it. That's why Anthropocene, because of the effect we've had on the planet itself. There's a lot of us organized variously on this planet. But I draw you a point, and maybe the minister referred to it about national. There are 193, and Comrade Eddie can correct me if I'm wrong with the numbers, that's recognized by the UN as countries. But there are 54 others that claim this, but are not recognized by us, including Palestine, including Western Sahara. So we haven't completed that project of national liberation in that context. Yeah. And I would be careful about us assuming that we can continue with these 193 guiding us out of the crises that we face. And there's a note there about what globalization has done to us. In terms of some of these dynamics, in terms of numbers again, a very important change has taken place just in the last few years. And this is a shrinkage in the more advanced and mature capitalists' share of the world economy. And increasingly, that share has been picked up by the developing countries, and especially those fast emerging countries within it. The BRICS is one example of those countries grouping together. But some of the troubles, especially those financial disclosures that all of you have read coming from Panama, also have an import on this issue itself. The change is happening. But the ones that are actually eroding are not going to give up the space that easily. As I'm sure no one needs to be reminded, a single country in the world, one of those 193, spends an inordinate amount of resources on destruction. You see the amount relative to the rest of us. But an important note there is the assumption that if you are spending more money, you are militarily superior, is being challenged in the context of asymmetric warfare today. So even putting all this money into weapons of mass destruction, distraction as well, does not change. Now, more pertinent to us and the questions that we are engaging with, over our more recent history and closer to us in the transition in South Africa is the question of the working class itself. And what we are experiencing is quite significant shifts in terms of those that relate to capitalism through a wage relationship. I'm sure reading all of the classics, most people would be encouraged to see it's a wage relationship that drives the exploitation of the working class. But as that wage relationship now becomes more tenuous, you see increasingly larger proportions of the population are outside of that wage relationship. And this is increasing. You can see the increases taking place in this slide itself from the ILO. Larger and larger parts of our societies across the world do not face the prospect of employment in front of them. What does this mean then for the type of world that we are being confronted with and that we need to respond to. I'm not going to do this slide in any detail because most of us will be familiar with the content. But I am questioning the nature of the type of transition we've been involved in. If we look at, in 2014, the fact that in 1994, it took 40 years for the average South African worker to earn as much as the average annual chief executive officer. In 2014, it would take 200 years for the average South African worker to earn the average annual CEO. I should maybe qualify, this is private sector CEOs. And then just to make sure that we're not seen as being overtly ideologically bound, there's a quote from that institution called the IMF. And even on their visit, they point to the stark and persistent inequality being perpetuated. The average white household still earns about 6 times the average black household in South Africa. So when we periodize, and this is also something quite important that I picked up over the 80s, in engaging with the literatures largely generated by Mzala and others, we have to be very clear about what we are describing. Yeah? And in describing things in this format, this is just a format of looking at our transition, but truncated. And a worry for me in this is the de-link in terms of our developmental objectives relative to the systems we are putting in place. In other words, what I'm trying to argue with you is that some of the systems we are putting in place, their objectives is not realizing an egalitarian South Africa, an equal Africa, or a developed global South. Another way of showing it much more harshly, because I would really encourage, notwithstanding how much attention we pay to politics, let's understand that politics is based on something at its base, and that's a production structure. Under capitalism, that has not changed. And look at what we were exporting in 1995, a year after attaining a constitutional democracy. And look at what we are exporting in 2014. You hardly see the change. You do see some important things, like the efforts made at industrial strategy by a particular department in South Africa. That's the auto sector. Other than that, we remain resource dependent, exporting items that we dig out of the ground. Yeah? And what is the effect of being so resource dependent? Is because it locks us further and further into a dependency model with the advanced, mature capitalist countries. Yeah? You must remember, while we focus a lot of time on the poor, the marginalized, the dispossessed, there are winners in these stories. And it's these winners that reproduce the system as such. I'm not wanting to call names, that's why we'll call it financial elites for now. But the financial elites are doing very well during all the crises we are facing. I'm not convinced we've managed to shine as much light as that thing in my eyes onto that sector and their effects on our society and our politics. Yeah. Part of this is also a self-criticism, and this is an important part, I think, for all of us to engage with. And that is the people that call themselves economists also refuse to acknowledge the importance of political economy. Economics is treated as neoclassical economics describing the world. It is a particular form of economics, not economics per se. So, I'm not going to get a chance to describe this, but if in questions it comes up, I can explain some of the Panama issues relative to how people shift profits across the world. The important point here, everyone's following the same formula. This is neoliberalism. Because they're all following the same formula, it's a race to the bottom. Every country is trying to lower the tax rate to attract investment. And what is the consequence for public institutions? What is the implications of this for our society? So, our times ahead are quite troubled. They're extraordinarily troubled. Yeah? But we can make sense of it. That's our object. We must analyze this in much more detail. One part that we don't have much say, and here I'm going to test between what is objective and what is subjective. The planet's capacity to bear us as a species is being threatened. And there are ways in which we can measure this. Do we use this before we engage in large-scale investments? Before we build infrastructures, do we account for the effect of that infrastructure? I'm sure the colleagues, small anecdote of us driving from the airport to here yesterday, and the amount of traffic on the road. So, civilian traffic is fine, but the amount of freight, the amount of these trucks carrying things on a fixed route that we continue, where is the infrastructure that's meant to remove this? I'm quite convinced there's a strong relationship between that heavy road usage and the number of deaths that we claim after every Easter. I'm sure that wasn't meant to be part of the Easter celebrations. But we have to change it. We can't continue doing the same thing, expecting other results. So, I want to encourage something that is emergent. And you'll notice I haven't put up something which says socialism or communism. Because what I'm encouraging people to at least embrace is that capitalism is eroding itself. And the signs are all around us. As the minister pointed out, it's not just a crisis of the system. Ideologically, it's becoming impossible to justify capitalism. Yeah. So this is, I mean, he had a left-wing background, Paul Mason, with some of us amongst the Trotskyites, a long time ago. He's now the economics editor for The Guardian. And this is a very nice popular book, which brings to bear some of the aspects that are forcing us into this narrowly framed future, where we are locked into and we look at economic models telling us answers. Models don't tell us answers, people tell us answers. But we engage in this as if it then allows us to continue a system that's not generating progressive outcomes. So we know that these threats face us, but we also know, and these are part of the global concerns around, I think, what we see in South Africa amongst especially the hashtag student movements at the moment. And that is that this idea of being able to explain it away, the kind of trickle down that we're expecting at some point, if that trickle down were true, it's going to be a tsunami, because that's how long we've been waiting for it. There is no evidence to suggest it is going to give us. Yeah. So it remains important for us, and UNCTAD, which plays a particular role in the world systems, also notes we need more viable and inclusive national development strategies now. And I would encourage that when we engage in the critique, it's towards helping build these strategies. We don't have all the answers, any one of us individually, but collectively we have the chance. You can't read that, I can't read it either. This is just to show you. This is from a good resource, so please have a look at it at your leisure. Hajun Chang's work, where he describes how different schools of economics look at the same problem. Yeah? But nearly everything on this slide offers neoliberal answers. So, back to the notion of self-criticism. And in putting forward this slide itself, I'm not criticizing an organizational form. I'm criticizing an institutional form. And that's what's happened to the universities. So again, I'm not going to read it out to you other than to say that the universities are becoming more and more complicit in taking us towards destruction rather than helping us resolve the crises. In Africa, there's a particular version of it as well. What we need to encourage and continuously do is engage in more critical analysis. We have to. We also need to embrace, and this is the work that comes through from the education policy units working together, the idea around socially engaged scholarship, and how important it is for all of us in transforming the institutions that academics are based at, not just reforming them. I'm not convinced only by removing statues that we change the way the institution operates. We need to change the content of it. So, this is now me rounding up what I've been saying. I'm sorry it's been the slow pace, but I've done this quite deliberately to encourage us to actually grasp the seriousness of the crises that we face. And remember, I've not mentioned anything about our local politics at all. But I'm suggesting that nearly every phenomenon that we see represented, maybe in those news agencies that left with the minister, has a correlation with all that I've been saying earlier. It's us that are not drawing the links between this. Yeah. So, just from the north of us, and Eddie, this adds to Pan-Africanism, but maybe from a different way. Samir Amin is one of our major intellectuals on the continent. Yeah. And I want to read this out. Liberalism creates nothing in the peripheries of the global south. These are the countries that agree to submit to it, other than crony capitalism based on a comprador state in opposition to a national state committed to sustainable economic and social development. For me, this is the contrast between a constitutional settlement, what some refer to as rainbows and other things, versus people's power. I really think we must do more, and you'll see the points underneath it, in transiting out of that mode of thinking. Final slide to remind you, these are not new ideas. Note the date at the bottom, 1515. This was Machiavelli's advice to the prince. For the reformers have enemies in all those who profit by the old order, and only lukewarm defenders in those who would profit by the new order. The lukewarmness arises partly from the fear of their adversaries and partly from not believing that it's going to be possible. Unless we build people's power and bring about transformation, it's not going to happen. And I worry that we would be doing a disservice to the courageous intellectuals that allowed us to think more critically. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Maraj. I think that we have done very well. Even though we started a bit late, we were able to confine ourselves to the time allocated. We'll still be able to break for tea at 11:30 as agreed or as reflected on the program. We have 20 minutes for engagement. Now, here are the ground rules. We only had 3 speakers for this session, excluding, of course, the official opening by the minister. We had 3 speakers. And I'm not going to accommodate a 4th or 5th speaker. all I will accommodate now are questions or comments. And a comment can't be a speech. In South Africa, there is one person I know of who went into the Guinness Book of Record for having been on the podium for 2 solid hours. That is Nxumalo Teres. Yeah, I went to the Guinness Book of Record. He delivered the longest speech, 2 hours, and we don't want to challenge him. Yeah. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, I will take questions or comments, and please indicate who the question or comment is addressed to. If it's a general comment, that is also fine, but keep it short and sweet so that you can accommodate a couple. So I will take 3 at a time. Do we have another open mic? Okay, let me identify hands for comments and questions. I have one at the back there. You have been noted. I first note them, and then they will start asking questions or making comments in the order I will have indicated. So I've noted one at the back. Any other? I have a second one here. Any other? Or I have a third one. So it's 1, 2, 3. Let's do them in reverse order because we're starting from here. So from here, we go there, and then the last one.
My question, hi everyone.
Could you please introduce yourself before making a comment or asking a question?
Sorry about that. My name is Jonathan Brady. I'm a master's student in Population and Development Studies from the University of KwaZulu-Natal. I have a question that's directed to Dr. Maharaj. I really enjoyed that presentation. I thought it was very poignant. A lot of sort of a very broad narrative of capitalism as an ideology, as a system that's brought us to where we are was, I think, explained in good detail. But I just have one question. For me, in looking at capitalism and what drives it, there's 2 things. There's effort and reward, meritocracy. How do we move past capitalism as a system that incentivizes people to go out and reward themselves through their hard work, which, you know, there's winners. Capitalism obviously creates winners and losers. I mean, socialism or communism or leftist thinking as such, it's been propagated or proposed numerous times, but it's never really caught on. What other alternatives are there? Because these are deeply inherent needs in us as human beings to find and reward ourselves for hard work, but that hard work at times often comes at the expense of others. How do we draw closer? Because capitalism as a system is eroding us as a society. It's creating deep divisions. But how do we get past that thinking?
Sure. Thank you.
Okay. I am Mr. Session1 from the UK, being Masters in Political Science. According to Machiavelli's ideology, which he penned some way back in 1515, and how do you see our rainbow nation in relation to Machiavelli's comments?
Thank you. Short and sweet.
Angibonge Dr. Ngomezulu. Igama Mkhumbuzo Mbanza from SANCO, General Secretary of SANCO. The first question is what we are observing now, particularly in the movement. When I talk about the movement, I talk about the broad progressive forces, including the alliance. I just want to check what happened to the non-racial character of the organization. I'm very much impressed with what I'm seeing here. All races represented here, but we are seeing more Africanization of our movement. And the question is that what chased the non-African cadres of the movement in our movement? I'm telling you, you'll go to the manifesto next week and you look at the stadium there.
it will be Africans, majority, 90% or more. The other question, the issue, because I will be leaving, I just want to throw this idea, Chair. The issue of the social distance between the leaders and those who are led, the masses. You could see that there is the challenge that we are faced with at this point in time. And then the issue that was raised by the minister of the issue of the progressive academic intellectuals and the non-academic. You don't see them in the national discourse, in the battle of ideas. Even when you watch the television programs and their debates there, they've disappeared. And the question is that why? The other issue that I would like maybe the House to discuss is the issue of the balance of forces currently, internationally, continentally, and nationally. And also the issue of the threats to our revolution, both internally and externally. And also to debate the issue of the state capture versus corporate capture, because sometimes people, they use these words interchangeable and they confuse them and they don't mean one and the same thing. The last one, Chair, is the issue of the land question. I think the root causes of all our problems, particularly here in South Africa, when we talk about the issue of poverty, unemployment, the triple challenges, I think most of them are also related on the issue of land. And I think we also need to debate this issue. Thanks very much, Chair.
Thank you.
So, thank you very much for the questions that people have raised. I think all three of the sets of questions actually hold something in common. So, I would like to start maybe by responding to the issues raised in common and then speak about the different parts that follow. You know, and this was triggered by, I think, towards the end, the colleague asked why you don't see people on TV, on television, with more radical ideas. We need to ask that question of ourselves. Isn't it our public broadcaster? Who are they promoting? Remember the one that used to give economic comments. Where is he today? It was from one bank to start off with. Yeah? So I'm just doing that facetiously, but the point being within it, we have much more within our power that we are not deploying. And part of that is us eroding the contributions that we can make to these important issues of discourse. The battle of ideas is taking place whether we participate or not. The question is, do we take coherent and cogent arguments into them? And so that's the common issues about it. But now the more specific ones. The first set of questions, and it points to, you'll excuse me, because the colleague raised it coming from a particular level of study as well. And this points to a failure in the system itself, if it presents capitalism as natural. Capitalism is not natural. It's not natural to us. It has a very definite lifespan when it was introduced and then changed systems around it. It's that changing of systems around it that then reinforce its message and treats it as if it were natural. What do I mean by this? The notion of having such a system as the mechanism to, you said, reward effort and incentivize behavior. I would suggest if we were to do a poll across the world, remember there's 7.4 billion of us on this planet as people, and we asked people, what is your motivation for waking up in the morning? I'm doubtful that the majority would say it's to keep capitalism in place. I'm sure in terms of people's lived conditions, it would be to turn the system on its head so that the object that's being realized through capitalism capitalism is realized through other mechanisms that are not as inhuman and barbaric. In other words, we can all still live a decent life where the object of us living is our improvement, is of us socializing, not chasing a wage. So in this, I also take the points you've raised. The experiments that we've had with variations of capitalism, as well as actually experienced socialism. Yeah. I'm not so sure anyone has declared communism as having been achieved in that sense. But in transiting towards something away from capitalism, we've learned a lot. That's why a lot of the literature today is around the notion of post-capitalism. Let us not prejudge and then lock things into a formulaic practice, but rather what we are seeing in forms like solidarity economies, in the care economy, a whole other way of reorganizing ourselves. The cooperative sector offers us another mechanism through which we can effect that. So, basic point being, what we see emerging around us is the end of capitalism. And I think part of our duty as intellectuals involved in this is to provide a sharper analysis connecting the challenges around race, class, and gender into that emergent form of a different way of organizing ourselves, so that we don't allow those inequities perpetuated under capitalism to reproduce themselves into the future, such that we may have a post-capitalism that has huge patriarchy built into it, that continues as if it were natural.
Yeah.
So we need to be much more agents of ourselves, as much as performing that agency function. I have very specific views about rainbows, and it's from a natural science perspective. And in the rainbow, colors never meet. That's a prism. That's what it does to light. And I think it's a very unfortunate metaphor to talk about what we are trying to generate for ourselves. We need sovereignty and national autonomy. We have to forge a nation for ourselves. Yeah. And in this, science is our friend. It is not our enemy. All of the evidence shows us what we see as the way we look differently is but an adaptation. At our core, our genetics are the same. We need to build a narrative around that and redress the continuation of discrimination based on something that does not exist. And it's an important point. And it's at odds sometimes at the way people frame things rhetorically. We definitely need non-racialism, but the path to non-racialism, at least from the part of the movements that I come from, is through an anti-racial study, not through a multiracialism.
Well, thanks, that's very profound. I take a different, I tend to take a historical view on racism and non-racialism and so on. Because I find that very useful in that all the Homo sapiens are Africans. They're one species that evolved after the dissemination of the dinosaurs on the African savanna. One of the apes evolved better than others. One of the apes evolved much better than others, developed by metabolism, dexterity of the fingers, a more advanced brain, etc., etc. And at a certain point, it also developed some belief systems. Believe that there is an afterlife, perhaps. There is a supernatural life, and they started worshipping. At the time, there was no deity. They were worshipping objects. And over time, the ape realized that these things that are growing, actually I could plant them. They started domesticating plants. In fact, these animals that are running around that I'm chasing, I could actually breed them. They started domesticating animals. And over time, this same ape
in domestic, especially out of the domestication of plants, started settlements. So they moved out of the caves and they started settlements which became known as human settlements, and out of human settlements emerged class and all the social data. And the state actually. The heroes and the warriors who led them united and become kings and so on and so on. But there's something specific about race here, is that these Africans, over time, 10,000 years ago, marched in different waves and populated the entire planet. Some went to Asia and they stunted and they became, there's a big debate on why in Asia it became, because others are saying from eating rice, others they settled in the Middle East, and then others crossed over into the Americas, etc. And in their evolution, some became white, like my sister is, but we're actually the same species that evolved on the African savanna, in the Serengeti. So racism is our creation. It emerges out of the contradiction of the very society that was created by us. Society is not natural. We created it ourselves when we started domesticating plants. Out of that process of human settlement emerged the state, emerged social stratification, blah, 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 blah. And even ideas on how to then configure the very society we created better than communism, socialism, and so on, and capitalism. So I take that view. Perhaps it's not a useful view. But what I wanted to, because a lot of comments that were made here were, in fact, they were not questions, they were comments. I wanted to talk briefly about what the Secretary General of the ANC spoke about, the color revolution. One comrade here asked a question about, in fact, made an observation about what you call the balance of forces and tried to counter revolution and so on. The SG spoke about elements of the color revolution in South Africa, and he was attacked even in social media, and nobody defended him. We've got our friend and old friend and comrade Vladimir Shubin. The concept of the color revolution was coined by the Russians, because the Russians, they learned that one of the ways that were used to destabilize the eastern part of Europe, and also in Latin America, Venezuela is one of the best examples, is organizing the youth movement, and so on and so on. We saw it in Georgia, and creating all these parties named after a color, others are yellow, others are the pink, and all those things. And they destabilize, and then they overthrow a democratically elected government. And the way they do it is that they start a social movement. They don't occupy a public square, maybe occupy some sort of Americana. I'm not saying Americana, it's a different context, where a social event happens outside the law, and then they start throwing themselves into the police, provoking the police to kill, to retaliate, and so on. It's in the headlines, and the media is deployed there. It's on the international. There is a crisis in the country. But if you go to that country, you find that it's only events around that square. Most part of the country is very quiet and normal. But we who are sitting, we think that country is deep, deep, deep in a crisis. And then they come in with the mediation efforts. They say, no, recognize these people, form an inclusive government, etc., etc. And that's how a number of governments were formed. And he spoke about the elements of the color revolution in South Africa. That some of our youth are being mobilized, are being organized, are being recruited by certain elements, and so on and so on. There was a reaction, including among our own people who said, no, SD, you are talking this thing. But I think the color revolution in South Africa has not been studied. In East Europe is being studied. The Chinese are also studying it. Tiananmen Square is an example of the color revolution. You know, you find that these are youth movements. They are funded by certain foundations. We know them. It's a full list. In fact, people who have been following maybe the Donald Trump campaign, they will know there was an article written by a Donald Trump supporter that the very foundations which have been exporting democracy are now fighting the rise of Donald Trump. They are funding, they are meeting, and they come there, they say they are promoting. They all have democracy, accountability, and so on. They fund certain organizations, but the purpose is to undermine the left agenda. So any left-leaning government is being undermined, and then these so-called alternative forces wearing certain colors are being promoted, and then they create a semblance of a crisis in a country, and a solution is then imposed on that country. And it can be backed up by a number of things. They can even activate the visa, the MasterCard to withdraw, and then you have, and even now Moody's, they come in, they declare you junk status. And this is how it works, the color revolution. and we are not free from it as South Africa. And that's what the SG was talking about, and some of us thought that no, the SG is conspiracy theory, etc. So I thought that's what I could add into the discussion, but some of the observations were very useful. But just on the issue of the Rainbow Nation, I'm not as learned as you are, and to bring into physics, into our understanding of the Rainbow Nation. But I think there must be a material basis to the Rainbow Nation. A Rainbow Nation which is based on certain people, the majority are stuck in the townships, living in poverty, in squatter camps and all those kinds, and another part of the rainbow that is living in opulence is unsustainable. The Rainbow Nation must have a material base and must be understood from its own material base. That's why in the ANC, we spoke at the Mangawung about the need for a second and a more radical transition towards the National Democratic Society that we want to. So the issues of the second, or what you call it, the second phase of the transition, I think, unfortunately, because of our own national debates about this and that, state capture, which is, I think, is an issue, I think we have lost sight of that big challenge that came out of the conference of the ANC in Mangaung, that we must now start tackling the material base of the post-apartheid transition, structural legacy of apartheid. And this is where our challenge is. This is the source of the frustrations of our own people. And I think we have to address. Unfortunately, we're dealing with some of the manifestations of these challenges and these frustrations. I think the key issue is the material basis on which this post-apartheid South Africa is founded.
Thank you very much, my dear professors. Yeah, we've run out of time, but I logged out 2 hands there. If you could make it very quick, we've run out of time. So it's Dr. Nagvi and then it's Dr. Kumar. Oh, there is also another. Please, let's make it quick. We've run out of time.
Okay, thanks. I want to pick up actually on your structural and cultural legacy that we're talking about apartheid and capitalism. And to go back to Machiavelli and experience, just to say that I want to pick up on experience as learning and praxis, which we haven't kind of been mentioning here. It goes back to the thing of practicing anti-racism, of practicing ways of being that are not capitalist and not competitive, and how we learn from each other. Just one of the things that struck me so much is at the moment in Zimbabwe there's a lot of back to land movement of youth. And they're rejecting the capitalist economy as a way of living and working cooperatively, working with natural organic methods of farming, etc. But it's consciously anti-capitalist. It's not just kind of undeveloped rural. And that's the stuff that I want us to pay more attention to.
Good, thank you.
Thank you. My question is for Professor Maharaj, relating to the comment you made on universities becoming a place of destruction, I think if I understood correctly. The question is, and I would agree with that, because the universities have now become punitive spaces where academics and researchers and students and so on try to actually go against the status quo, say radical things, you're going to be called in and sort of punished, so to speak, or there's other ways of doing it. So my question is really about how to make the university a safe space again for ideas. And to, in the recent sort of spate of, the student protest action, we saw private securities being called in, we saw all kinds of, heavy-handed tactics being used. Universities are no longer safe spaces for ideas, and we need to actually go back to that. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on how to generate that again. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Bugule Kuman. This is really more of a comment than a question to Eddie. Eddie, you mentioned that the kind of engagement that is happening on our continent, political, around the political system that we are trying to foster, suggests that these two schools of thought are pulling to different directions. But the one at the moment, I suppose, it might be dominant, which is this Pan-Africanist trend. My big worry is that you also mentioned something that which is quite ominous, that it seems like this move is more about deal-making between political elites and attempts to distance these structures from the general populace. And I wonder if you can say sort of a bit more on how the left can somehow insert itself into this transaction, if you like, so that whatever happens to our continental system still really is grounded around ideas and around engagement by all of us, the working class, as a driving force of those systems.
Okay, my speakers, please respond to this in less than a minute each.
I'll be very quick. No, I think the question that was raised is a very difficult question because it's about organizing and building a movement. I think the approach that the left would consider, instead of organizing strictly as a left formation on the continent, to be much more difficult because I think the conditions are quite difficult for that kind of an approach. But what will work is a much broader progressive movement. So you'll have left, you'll have some of the center-left forces, you'll have the populists, you'll have the, just general protest movement. So you have a lot of, in fact, what is quite a lot of on continent outside the state is the protest movement and the populist forces and so on. So these are very strong and active movement, but ideologically probably less as cultivated as the left, because the left will be much more clearly defined in precisely, in more precise terms ideologically and in terms of the organizational and methods that the left will offer and so on. Because the large part of the continent is the rural, it's the unemployed, is the petty, you could say, you don't have an advance. For example, you don't have advance. The working class movement is not that well advanced and well developed on the continent. Even the African bourgeoisie itself is still comprador and in many ways very dependent, etc. And the orientation of the states also reflect quite a lot of things. So if you try to build a narrowly defined left movement on the continent, you will be overtaken and you will be overwhelmed by the power of the state, because the state commands resources, influence, and quite a lot. But I think the approach will be building a much broader and inclusive alliance of the progressive forces on the continent.
Thanks very much. I think it will make an interesting segue between us. So I'll pick up on the state part, and this refers both to universities and what we've heard as the police. What are the origins of these institutions? Specifically the police itself. Yeah. And I worry that we pay little attention and we expect to reform them to perform another function. Their object is policing capitalism. So let's keep that in mind. The universities are increasingly becoming the route to a capitalist placing. And this is where I think much more needs to be done in both those institutions around transformation, but transformation linking it. And I want to link this directly back to part of the theme of what we're going to talk about in the next day and a half, which is about what does people's power actually mean? If these institutions are so arrayed against us, how can we expect them to give us a different effect? There are many of us sitting inside this audience whose experiences of the police is not positive. Neither is our experiences of being in universities at a different time. So I'm just saying, let's keep pushing. The thing is, we need to open our minds to alternative ways of looking at the same phenomena, and at least encourage through participation that we build this alternative. I would discourage looking at it, and I know the rhetoric and why we have that goal for 63. I prefer in my lifetime. So I want to keep pushing. Let's try to see how we can bring things closer to us, take responsibility for the things we are putting in play. Those resolutions we pass must find the expression in what we do.
2063, my friend, is 50 years later. It means, I tell you, you won't be alive in the next 60 years. So you must address the issue of the lifespan. So the SDGs then.
Muammar Gaddafi was not alone. He is another one. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your cooperation. Thank you very much for our presenters. We really appreciate it. And let's give them a round of applause. then as this ends now, my slot ends now. I will then hand over to Derek, who will tell us what to do next. Otherwise, it was nice doing business with you. Thank you.
Thanks. We're going to break for tea and then come back.